The air in Varnia didn't just smell like smoke, it smelled like something deeper, something broken. It had been a year since the world watched, helpless as entire villages vanished from maps and memory. Satellite images showed what no one wanted to believe. Mass graves dug by bulldozers, schools turned into holding pens, and roads littered with shoes, tiny ones, worn out ones, some still tied with laces. Over 30,000 lives gone, not in battle, not in accident, but by design. In the ruins of what used to be Lyra City, people moved like ghosts. They weren't shouting. They weren't crying out loud. The grief had settled so deep it had gone quiet. Among them was a woman who used to teach literature at the local university. Now she spent her days sorting through charred books and broken furniture, looking for anything that might still carry a name, a face, a memory. Her husband had been a history teacher. Her two sons, 12 and 9, had loved soccer and comic books. All three had been taken in the first wave, dragged from their home at dawn and never seen again. She buried them with hundreds of others in a field outside town, marked only by a wooden plank and a red scarf tied to a stick, their favorite color. She didn't speak much these days. But when she did, people listened. Not because she raised her voice, but because her words carried the weight of someone who had lost everything and still chose to stand. News crews came and went. Politicians made speeches. The United Nations held emergency meetings where diplomats in crisp suits debated words like proportionality and sovereignty, while children in Varnia drank water from puddles. Sanctions were announced. Aid packages promised, but none of it brought back the dead. None of it filled the silence in homes where laughter used to live. In refugee camps along the border, the mood was different. Their anger hadn't gone quiet, it had sharpened. Young men huddled around campfires, not talking about rebuilding, but about revenge. Why wait for courts that move like glaciers? One asked, his eyes hollow but burning. They killed our families like animals. Now they walk free, drinking coffee and Dravik while we sleep on dirt. Others nodded. Some had seen their parents shot in front of them. Some had hidden in forests for weeks, eating bark to survive. The idea of waiting years for a trial felt like another kind of betrayal. Whispers turned into plans. At first it was just talk, about tracking down the soldiers who'd led the raids, about making them feel even a fraction of the pain they'd caused. But soon those whispers found ears beyond the camps. In cities across Europe and North America, members of the Varnian diaspora began sending more than just money for blankets and medicine. They sent encrypted messages, old military contacts, even weapons bought on the black market. Not everyone agreed. Some elders warned that vengeance would only bring more blood. But the younger generation had stopped believing in patience. Back in the ruins, the woman who used to teach literature watched this shift with growing worry. She understood the rage. She felt it clawing inside her chest every morning when she woke up alone. But she also remembered her husband's last words to her, scribbled on a scrap of paper slipped through a prison van window. Don't let them turn you into a monster too. She started speaking again, not in anger, but in sorrow. At community gatherings, she'd stand quietly and say things like, "Justice isn't the same as revenge, Ratin," or, "If we kill their children, whose hands are clean then?" Some listened. Many didn't. One evening, a teenager spat on the ground near her feet and said, "You lost your family. I lost mine too, but I won't beg the world to care. I'll make them fear us instead." The first act of retaliation came quietly. A border guard from Korvath, a man identified by survivors as having overseen a massacre in a village church, was found dead in his home. No explosion, no spectacle, just a single bullet and a note pinned to his chest. For the children of Lyra. News of it spread like wildfire through the camps. Some wept, others cheered. In the capital cities of powerful nations, officials condemned the killing as terrorism. But in the mud-floored tents of Varnian refugees, it was called justice. The woman who buried her family didn't celebrate. That night, she walked to the edge of the mass grave field and sat in the dark. She didn't pray. She didn't cry. She just sat, listening to the wind move through the trees like it always had, as if the earth hadn't cracked open beneath them. She knew what was coming. Once vengeance starts, it's hard to stop. It feeds on itself. And the world, so quick to look away during the killing, would now watch closely as the victims became hunters. But no one was asking the real question. What happens after the last enemy falls? Because when the blood is dry and the guns go quiet, someone still has to rebuild the schools. Someone still has to teach the children how to trust, and someone, maybe her, would have to remind them that being human means more than just surviving. It means choosing, even in the darkest hour, what kind of world you want to leave behind. For now, though, the choice had been made. Not by governments, not by treaties, but by broken hearts that had run out of hope and turned to fire instead. And in the distance, beyond the hills, smoke began to rise again, not from burning homes this time, but from training grounds where boys who should have been in classrooms were learning how to aim rifles. The world had failed to stop the genocide. Now, it would watch what happened when the survivors decided to finish it themselves. Life in the refugee camps wasn't just about waiting. It was about watching time stretch out like a road with no end. Tents flapped in the wind, meals came in plastic packets, and every morning began with the same question: what now? For many, especially the young, the answer had changed. It wasn't hope, it wasn't peace, it was action. In the early days after the genocide, people gathered to mourn, to share stories, to hold each other up. But as months passed and nothing changed, no arrests, no real justice, just more empty promises, the mood shifted. Grief hardened into something sharper. Anger didn't just live in their chests anymore. It moved through their hands, their voices, their choices. A quiet schoolteacher, once known for his gentle way with children, now stood at the edge of a pine forest teaching teenagers how to dismantle a rifle. He didn't enjoy it. His hands still trembled when he touched metal, but he remembered the day soldiers dragged his students out of their classroom and never brought them back. He remembered their names, all 23 of them, and he told himself, if no one else will hold them accountable, we will. Word spread fast, not through social media. Phones were scarce, but through handshakes, coded phrases, and late-night walks between tents. The Lyran resistance wasn't an official army. It had no uniforms, no headquarters, just people who'd lost everything and decided that silence was no longer an option. They started small. A Corvath border patrol truck found with slashed tires, a radio tower knocked out in the dead of night. Then came the first real strike. A low-level officer who'd bragged in a bar about cleaning entire villages. He was found unconscious outside his home, his uniform cut into pieces, a single photo of a Lyran child taped to his chest. No one was hurt badly, but the message was clear. We see you. We remember. Back in the camps, this act lit something inside people. For the first time since the massacres, they felt a flicker of power. Not the kind that comes from guns, but from knowing they weren't helpless anymore. Mothers who'd spent nights rocking empty cradles now stitched pouches for medicine and bandages. Former shopkeepers shared maps they'd memorized as kids. Even elders who once warned against violence began turning a blind eye, not because they approved, but because they understood. When the world looks away, you protect your own. But not everyone agreed. The woman who used to teach literature watched this shift with growing unease. She'd seen what vengeance did, to nations, to families, to souls. She knew that once you start down that road, it's hard to turn back. One evening, she stood before a group gathered around a fire and said softly, "They took our homes, our families, our future. Don't let them take our humanity too." Some nodded. Others looked away. One young man, barely 18 with burns on his arms from hiding in a bombed-out bakery, replied, "Humanity didn't save my sister. Justice will." And so the resistance grew, not with fanfare but with quiet determination. They trained in hidden clearings, learned to move without sound, practiced sending messages through songbirds and laundry lines. They weren't soldiers. They were bakers, students, mechanics, ordinary people who'd been forced into an extraordinary fight. Support came from unexpected places. In cities far away, members of the Varnian diaspora, people who'd escaped years before, sent money, old military manuals, even encrypted radios. They couldn't fight on the ground, but they refused to stay silent. "We may live in safety," one wrote in a letter smuggled into the camp, "but our hearts are still in the soil of Lyra." Meanwhile, the world outside watched with nervous eyes. News reports called the resistance freedom fighters or terrorists, depending on who was speaking. Governments condemned violence but offered no real path to justice. The International Criminal Court moved slowly, buried in paperwork and political red tape. Survivors didn't have years to wait. They had nights full of nightmares and days full of ghosts. The turning point came when the Resistance pulled off something no one thought possible. Using a stolen drone and a smuggled SIM card, they tracked the movements of a high-ranking Korvath commander, someone directly linked to the church massacre. They didn't attack his home. They didn't harm his family. Instead, they released footage, grainy but undeniable. Video of him giving orders, laughing as buildings burned, pointing to lists of names. They sent it to every major news outlet, every embassy, every human rights group. Overnight, the world couldn't ignore it. Protests erupted in capital cities. Sanctions tightened. For the first time, a real official was named, shamed and, though still free, exposed. In the camps, people gathered around a single battery-powered radio, listening as the news played on loop. Some cried. Some stood in stunned silence. Others whispered, "This is just the beginning." But with every success came danger. Korvath forces doubled patrols. Informants crept into the camps, offering food or medicine in exchange for names. Trust became the rarest currency. Friends eyed each other. Families argued behind closed flaps. Was that stranger really a cousin from the north or a spy? The woman who taught literature began visiting families quietly, not to preach but to listen. She'd sit with mothers who feared their sons would disappear into the forest and never return. She'd hold the hands of old men who remembered past wars and knew how easily revenge turns into endless war. "There's a difference," she'd say gently, "between making them pay and becoming what we hate." Her words didn't stop the resistance, but they planted seeds, small ones, in the hearts of those who still remembered how to question, how to doubt, how to hope for something more than blood. One rainy night, a young fighter came to her tent, soaked and shaking. He'd just returned from a mission. Not a violent one, just surveillance. But he'd seen something that haunted him. A Korvath soldier, no older than him, crying alone in a trench, clutching a photo of his own child. He looked human, the boy admitted, voice breaking. "What if we're all just scared kids with guns?" She didn't have an answer. She just handed him a dry blanket and a cup of weak tea. Sometimes that was enough. The resistance wasn't going away. The fire had been lit. But in the quiet corners of the camp, another kind of resistance was growing too, the kind that refused to let hatred be the only legacy of the dead. And so, between the forest and the firelight, between vengeance and memory, the people of Lyra stood at a crossroads. One path led to more blood, the other to something harder, healing. No one knew which they'd choose, but the choice was theirs, and theirs alone. 2 years after the genocide, the silence that once hung over Varnia had been replaced by a different kind of noise. Not the sound of bombs or gunfire, but the hum of tension, like a wire pulled too tight. The world had moved on in many ways. Headlines shifted. New crises emerged. But for those still living in the shadow of what happened, time hadn't healed anything. It had only sharpened the edges of their pain. The resistance, once a scattered group of grieving neighbors, had become something more organized, more dangerous. They weren't just striking at random anymore. They had intelligence, strategy, and a growing network of supporters across borders. Their biggest move yet came on a cold morning in early spring, during a military parade in Dravik, the capital of Korvath. As crowds cheered and brass bands played, a single drone, small, quiet, nearly invisible, hovered above the reviewing stand. It didn't drop a bomb. It dropped truth. Minutes later, the footage was everywhere. The man who'd planned the church massacre, the one who'd signed the orders to burn villages and separate families, standing proudly in uniform, until a voice cut through the speakers of every phone, every radio, every public screen in the city. "You called them vermin. You locked them in basements. You erased their names. But we remember." Then came the images, photos of the dead, names read aloud, voices of survivors describing what they saw. The parade froze. The general tried to keep walking, but his face said everything. Within hours, protests erupted outside his home. Diplomats scrambled. And in Varnia, people gathered around cracked screens and battery-powered radios, tears streaming down faces that hadn't cried in months. But the resistance didn't stop there. A week later, that same general was found dead, not in a dramatic explosion, but quietly in his study. No one else was hurt, just him. A single note on his desk: "Justice doesn't wait." To many in the camps, it felt like the first real victory, like the world finally understood that words weren't enough. Celebrations were muted. No music, no dancing. But there was a quiet pride in the way people held their heads a little higher. They thought they could hide behind medals and speeches, one elder said. Now they know we're watching. But pride came with a price. Within days, Korvath forces cracked down hard. Raids on remaining Lyran neighborhoods intensified. Curfews tightened. Anyone suspected of ties to the resistance, real or imagined, disappeared. Families who'd stayed behind hoping to rebuild were now trapped in a new wave of fear. The violence wasn't over. It had just changed shape. Meanwhile, in courtrooms thousands of miles away, prosecutors at the International Criminal Court struggled to build cases. Witnesses were too scared to speak. Evidence had been destroyed. Key officials had vanished or been promoted to untouchable positions. The system meant to deliver justice moved like a clock with no hands, always ticking, never telling time. Western governments, nervous about regional instability, pushed for a ceasefire. Dialogue is the only path forward, one diplomat said on live television. But to those who'd buried children with their own hands, dialogue sounded like another word for delay. Back in the camps, the divide grew deeper. Some believed the resistance had gone too far. Killing even a guilty man felt like crossing a line they couldn't uncross. Others argued that without fear there would be no justice. They only understand power, a young woman said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. And we finally have some. The woman who used to teach literature found herself walking a thin line. She didn't support violence, but she refused to condemn those who chose it, not when the world had offered them nothing else. Instead, she began working with aid groups to document testimonies, to preserve names, to build a record that couldn't be erased. If we can't get justice today, she told a group of survivors, we'll make sure the truth survives until someone can. Her work drew quiet support and quiet suspicion. Some saw her as a voice of reason. Others whispered that she was too soft, too willing to wait while their enemies walked free. One night, someone left a stone on her tent flap. A warning, not a threat, but enough to make her heart race. Still, she kept going. Because she knew something the fighters sometimes forgot. Vengeance might feel like closure, but it rarely brings peace. And peace, real, lasting peace, needed more than blood. It needed memory. It needed truth. It needed people willing to speak when others wanted to scream. Then came the hospital incident. It was meant to be a strike on a military logistics office hidden in a government building. But intelligence was wrong or outdated. The building had been converted into a civilian hospital just weeks before. The drone hit during visiting hours. Dozens were hurt. Children among them. The resistance claimed it was a mistake. They apologized in a coded message sent through underground channels. But apologies don't undo damage. And in the eyes of the world, the line between fighter and aggressor blurred even more. Protests against the resistance grew, even among Lyran communities abroad. We can't become what they were, one community leader said in a tearful speech. If we do, they've won twice. Inside the camps, shame mixed with anger. Some fighters wanted to double down. Others questioned everything. The young man who'd once said justice will now sat alone for hours, staring at his boots, wondering if he'd traded one kind of horror for another. The woman visited him. She didn't lecture. She just sat beside him in the dirt and said, mistakes don't make you evil, but what you do next, that's who you are. In Geneva, exhausted diplomats finally announced a truce. Troops would pull back, aid corridors would open, a joint monitoring team would be formed. But there was no mention of trials, no reparations, no accountability, just stop fighting. For many, it felt like a betrayal wrapped in peace. They want us to forgive before we've even buried our dead, the woman told a reporter who'd managed to sneak into the camp. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. You can't build peace on silence. You build it on truth. As night fell over Varnia, the camps were quiet again, but not peaceful. The fire of vengeance still smoldered, but so did something else, doubt. And maybe, just maybe, the first fragile shoots of a different kind of courage, the kind that dares to imagine a future where justice doesn't require more graves. The world had chosen diplomacy. But the people? They were still deciding what justice really meant. The ceasefire held, but barely. Like a rope stretched too thin, it creaked under the weight of everything left unsaid. On paper, the agreement looked hopeful. Troops pulling back, aid trucks rolling in, promises of joint patrols. But on the ground, trust was gone. And without trust, even silence felt dangerous. In the camps, people watched the aid convoys roll past with tired eyes. Yes, there was food now, medicine, clean water, but none of it filled the hole where justice should have been. The truce had no trials, no confessions, no real reckoning. Just a handshake between men in suits who'd never buried a child with their own hands. To many, it felt like the world had traded truth for quiet and called it peace. The resistance fractured. Some fighters, exhausted and heartsick after the hospital mistake, laid down their weapons. They didn't believe in surrender. They believed in something harder, stopping the cycle. Others refused. They got away with murder, one said bitterly, sharpening a knife by firelight. And now we're supposed to act like it never happened? Arguments turned into shouting matches. Old friends stopped speaking. Families split down the middle, some clinging to the hope of reconciliation, others swearing they'd never rest until every name on their list was crossed out. The woman who used to teach literature saw this divide like a crack running through the soul of her people. She knew vengeance had given them strength when they had none. But she also saw how it was eating them from the inside, turning grief into rage, rage into blindness. One evening, she stood before a small group gathered in a half-rebuilt schoolhouse and said, "We can't rebuild a home on ashes if we keep setting new fires." Her words didn't stop the anger, but they gave space to something else, doubt. And doubt sometimes is the first step toward change. She began meeting quietly with elders, teachers, even former fighters who'd walked away. They talked not about revenge, but about memory, about how to honor the dead without dragging the living into more darkness. Slowly, carefully, they started planning something new. Not a court, not a war council, but a place where people could speak. Where survivors could say what happened. Where maybe even those who'd done wrong could listen. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever, but it was a start. Meanwhile, in Korvath, hardliners used the truce to tighten their grip. They painted all Lyrans as terrorists, using the hospital incident as proof. "See," they told their people, "they don't want peace. They want to destroy us." Fear spread like fog, and with it, silence. Those who'd once whispered doubts about the genocide now kept their mouths shut. Speaking up felt like signing your own death warrant. But not everyone stayed quiet. Deep in Korvath's countryside, a retired school principal, one who'd hidden 3 Lyran families in her barn during the worst days, began writing letters. Not to officials, but to ordinary people. She described what she'd seen. Neighbors dragged from homes, children separated from parents, the smell of burning books. She didn't accuse. She just bore witness. And slowly, others joined her. A nurse who'd treated wounded Lyrans in secret. A bus driver who'd smuggled families across checkpoints. Their stories, passed hand to hand, began to chip away at the official lie. Back in Varnia, the woman heard about these whispers. It gave her hope, not the loud, fiery kind, but the quiet kind that grows in the dark like roots. Then came the breaking point. A young fighter, one of the most committed, led a raid on a Korvath supply depot near the border. It was supposed to be empty, but intelligence failed again. Inside were not soldiers, but workers. Men who loaded crates, fixed engines, sent money home to their kids. One was killed in the crossfire. The resistance called it collateral damage. The world called it another step toward becoming the enemy. The woman didn't wait for a meeting. She walked straight to the fighter's tent. He was cleaning his boots, eyes red from lack of sleep. She didn't yell. She just sat across from him and said, "Tell me about him, the man who died." He looked away. He worked for them, but was he one of them? The ones who gave the orders? Who lit the fires? The young man didn't answer. His silence said everything. That night he disappeared, not to fight but to think. Days later he returned and handed over his weapon. "I can't keep guessing who deserves to die," he said. "I'm tired of being afraid of my own shadow." His choice rippled through the camp. Others followed, not all, but enough. At the same time, international pressure grew. Human rights groups, armed with the testimonies the woman and her team had collected, pushed harder for a real truth process. Not punishment alone, but understanding. Not just who did it, but why did we let it happen? In Geneva, diplomats, worn down by years of failure, finally agreed to support a local-led initiative, the Varnian Truth and Memory Commission. No judges, no jail cells, just a space to speak, to listen, and to record what happened before it faded into myth or denial. Many survivors refused to join. "Talking won't bring back my daughter," one mother said, clutching a faded school photo. Others worried it was a trick, a way for the guilty to pretend they were sorry and walk free. But some came, not for the perpetrators, for themselves, to say out loud what they'd carried in silence for years. The first session was held in a rebuilt community hall. Sunlight streamed through new windows. Chairs were arranged in a circle, not rows. No flags, no uniforms. Just people. A man stood, thin, gray-haired, hands shaking, and described watching his brother taken away. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just told the story, detail by detail, until the room was so quiet you could hear someone crying softly in the back. Afterward, no one clapped. No one cheered. But something shifted. Like a stone lifted off a chest, the woman watched from the corner, tears in her eyes. This wasn't victory. It wasn't even healing yet. But it was human, real, messy, and honest. Outside, the world kept spinning. Politicians made new deals. News cycles moved on. But in that room, something rare happened. People chose to face the truth together, without weapons, without masks. Vengeance had given them fire. But maybe, just maybe, truth could give them light. 5 years after the genocide, Varnia didn't look like a place that had known peace. But it no longer looked like a graveyard either. The scars were still there. Bullet holes in church walls, patches of earth where nothing would grow, the empty chair at every family table. But life, stubborn and quiet, had started to return. Wildflowers pushed through cracked pavement. Children's laughter, tentative at first, echoed in rebuilt courtyards. And in a small field just outside what used to be Lyra City, a stone memorial stood, carved with 30,000 names. The war hadn't ended with a grand battle or a signed treaty. It had faded slowly like a fever breaking. The resistance didn't vanish overnight, but its fire dimmed as more fighters chose to lay down their arms. Not because they'd forgotten, but because they were tired of carrying so much rage in their bones. Some joined rebuilding crews. Others became teachers, teaching kids not just math and reading, but how to ask hard questions without shouting. A few disappeared into silence, carrying wounds too deep for words. The Truth and Memory Commission became the quiet heartbeat of the healing. It wasn't perfect. Some who'd done terrible things never showed up. Others came but spoke in half-truths, hiding behind orders and duty. But for many survivors, just being heard was enough. They told their stories in rooms filled with strangers who cried with them, not out of pity but shared sorrow. Recordings were made, transcripts saved. Schools began including these testimonies in their history lessons, not to teach hate but to teach vigilance. The woman who used to teach literature became one of the commission's quiet anchors. She didn't lead meetings. She didn't give speeches. But she was always there, making tea, holding a hand, listening when no one else could bear to. She'd lost everything, yet she refused to let loss be the only thing that defined her people. "We are more than our pain," she'd say softly. "We have to be." Not everyone agreed. Some families still refused to participate. "No words bring back my child," one father said, staring at his son's name on the memorial. He visited every week, left a small stone, and walked away without speaking to anyone. And that was okay. Healing wasn't a race. It wasn't even a straight line. Some days it looked like progress. Other days it looked like sitting in silence, staring at the rain. But something unexpected began to happen. In a village rebuilt with help from international aid, and quietly, from former Korvath citizens who'd sent money anonymously, Lyran and Korvath children started attending the same school. At first, they sat on opposite sides of the room. Teachers didn't force friendship. They just taught fairness, respect, and the truth about what happened. Slowly, soccer balls were shared. Notes were passed. A Korvath boy helped a Lyran girl fix her broken pencil case. No one made a big deal of it. But it mattered. In Dravik, too, change stirred. A small museum opened, not glorifying war, but showing photos of the missing, letters from survivors, even confessions from low-level soldiers who'd finally broken their silence. Attendance was low at first. Then a school group came. Then another. People began to whisper, We didn't know it was this bad. Denial didn't vanish, but it lost its grip. Back in Varnia, the annual Memorial Day was no longer just about mourning. It became a day of remembrance and reflection. People lit candles not just for the dead, but for the living who carried their memory. That year, the woman stood before the stone wall as dusk fell. She didn't speak to a crowd. She just lit a single candle and placed it gently at the base of the memorial. The flame flickered in the wind but didn't go out. Nearby, a teenager, barely born when the genocide happened, watched her. He'd heard the stories from his grandmother. He'd read the transcripts at school. He didn't understand all of it, but he knew this. His people had almost been erased. And yet here they were. Later that evening, in a community hall, elders and young people gathered not for a meeting but for a simple meal. Bread was shared. Soup passed around. No speeches. Just presence. And in that ordinary act, eating together after everything, there was something powerful. A choice not to forget, not to pretend, but to live anyway. The world had moved on long ago. News channels covered new wars, new crises. But in Varnia, the real work continued, not with headlines, but with hands. Hands planting trees where mass graves once were. Hands building benches in parks named after the lost. Hands holding other hands across old divides. Vengeance had felt necessary once. It had given people strength when they had none. But it had also nearly cost them their future. Now they were learning that peace wasn't the absence of pain. It was the courage to carry it without passing it on. There were still nights when someone woke up screaming. Still days when a song or a smell sent someone back to the worst moment of their life. But there were also mornings when a child ran through the street laughing, and for a few seconds the weight lifted. The road ahead wasn't easy. Trust would take generations to rebuild. Justice would always feel incomplete. But they'd chosen something harder than revenge: coexistence. Not because they'd forgotten, but because they remembered and didn't want anyone else to suffer what they had. As stars appeared in the clear night sky, the woman walked home alone. She passed a school where lights were still on, teachers preparing lessons for tomorrow. She smiled faintly. Tomorrow, children would learn not just about the past, but about how to build a different kind of future. Humanity had chosen vengeance first. It was fast. It was loud. It felt like justice, but in the end, it was the quiet choices, the shared meal, the honest story, the child's hand reaching across a classroom, that began to stitch the world back together, and that, more than anything, was worth remembering.